Welcome Sibongile Nkosi to chat a little bit further. Sibongile, good morning. Thank you very much for joining us here on Weekend Dawn. I mean, ultimately, in the letter that you penned in the Mail and Guardian, you say that conversations about effects of racism, ageism and gender bias in civil society organizations need to occur. I mean, just given the general context, the historical context of what the general structure of South African civil societies look like, I mean, how would such issues continue to plague them at large?
Yeah, I must say, I mean, in the piece, one of the things I highlight is that the civil society organizations historically were actually mostly led by white leftist liberals, and the people that were serving were mostly black disadvantaged communities, and the staff was also just black people. But I think over the years we've seen the transformation happening, but it's happening at a very slow rate. And I think one of the things that is not happening is that while the transformation while the talk around transformation and putting like black leaders and black women specifically is happening, it's not happening at a faster rate. But also when it's happening, the organizations themselves do not prepare themselves enough, and they do not have enough conversation on what does it mean to have a young black leader, right? And what structures and what strategies do we need to implement. And basically then what you tend to see is that when black women come on board or black people come on board, they still face the same issues I talked about: racism, ageism, and huge racial barriers, and structural barriers. So basically, I think for me, I'm saying if civil society is saying they're serious about transformation, those conversations need to happen of what does it mean to hire black women in leadership, and what structures and what support do we need to implement so that this is more effective and more realistic.
So Sibongile, I mean, on that note, you speak about some of the slow rate of transformation in civil society organizations, and ultimately looking at the indicators that are used to define what transformation looks like. I mean, being at the helm of the organization as its CEO, I mean, how do we redefine those indicators? What does a truly empowered woman look like then?
So for me, I mean, one of the things that happened with me was that I was coming into the organization, and when a black woman comes into that organization, the expectation was so much higher, right? And already there were stereotypes around incompetency, hugely stereotyped. So I think even one of the racial issues that we face as black leaders is already there's a stereotype of either corruption, incompetency, and then what you see there is that you are not actually supported, and you're also more scrutinized as rather than your predecessor, so that's what I was facing. And one of the things that was also happening is that my thing is that you also need to think about the structures of the board, right? So in my case was what I found is that when I came in, the structure of the board was still the same. So it was predominantly white people in the board. And when I spoke about black issues, it was as if in the piece I talk about being labeled as the angry black woman, right? So I think one of the things we need to start by having conversations about what are some of the racial stereotypes that we see around black people in this country. And I mean, those conversations are happening. And then talk about what does it look like to transform that organization. So for me, it's about changing the board of the organization, changing the staff constituency, but also having those conversations. I mean, in the piece, I say, when I got hired, I could feel, I could sense how the white staff were feeling, right? So how about in that instance, having that conversation on what does it look like for white people now to be led by a black woman? Because historically that has not happened. And I mean, in the piece, I've said this, right, that unfortunately, South Africa does not see black women as a form of authority. So what does that look like right now, right? So how do we create programs that look at inclusion? How do we create programs that reimagine a change in leadership? And for me, it's saying civil society needs now to actually start looking at those conversations and unpacking it. So for me, what would it look like to change the structure of the board to actually represent the demographics of my leadership, but also the people we serve? I mean, civil society organizations serve predominantly disadvantaged communities, Black disadvantaged communities. So what that means is that predominantly the boards of these organizations need to be mostly that, but also even in the organizations, what we are seeing is that even in organizations, senior positions are still with mostly white people, white women specifically. And my thing is also like, how do we make sure that there's diversity in the hiring in these organizations? And this is not just the conversation, civil society in South Africa, it's even global, because there's been so many global conversations that are coming up. So for me, it's about the board structures, that we need to continuously look at the board structures, but then also look at the organization itself and also look at policies in the organizations. Absolutely. One of the things that happened with me was that when I came in, there was a lot of Black staff that did not have access to cars. So when they were going on stories, they were using taxis. One of the things I implemented is an Uber system so that Black staffs are benefited. Secondly, things like Provident Fund, right? A lot of media NGOs do not have Provident Funds. And if you think about a Black staff that comes from a disadvantaged community that does not have generational wealth, needs a provident fund to create that wealth. You know what I mean? So it's things that are policies, HR policies, the structures of the organizations. For me, it's that we need to look at, when we're saying Black leadership, think about the structure of the organizations, think about the policy.
Sibongile, you rightfully mentioned the paradigm shifts that need to happen, and it seems that the unconscious biases are definitely coming to the fore. As we take a look at what the structures of interpretation looks like, because you also speak about a post-honeymoon phase. I mean, after being appointed, you question whether it was window dressing, you question whether it was tokenism, you question whether you were just there to somewhat decorate the space at large. And I love the fact that you allude to policy and change, because through that we are then able to hold all a society accountable to see that change come into effect. Now I want to know, in terms of fighting back, what did you ultimately end up doing? How do you think that was the most effective way to express your dissatisfaction with what was happening in the civil society organization?
So the first thing I did was to confront, right? To firstly confront the racial issues in the organizations, particularly I started with the staff themselves, right? That I was talking about in the piece, to say, look at your privilege, right? You come from a privileged background, but also you need to actually, because one of the things, I in the piece, one of the white staff was saying that her team works much harder. And I said, you need to be careful in the ways you frame this, right? And then after that, I went specifically to speak to the board, right? But again, I was interpreted as angry. One of the board members even said something behind my back saying I was dramatic and I was using race for everything. And for me, you cannot say such statements in South Africa. I actually went to the donors themselves to highlight these racial issues, the ways in which I was treated, the ways in which I was undermined. But more specifically, I faced a lot of backlashing, especially when I started implementing policies that were very pro-Black staff. I was scrutinized a lot. When I was hiring Black staff in senior positions, I was questioned by the board themselves about those positions. And specifically then at every turn, I was scrutinized. Things like my credit card was specifically asked. There was just minor little things. Even my staff, the Black senior staff, were targeted. White staff members were colliding with the board members, So I faced quite a lot of backlashing for just highlighting some of the structural things in the organizations, but also changing the organization, right? So the organization was supposed to remain the same. So that's why I talk about window dressing, that when the minute I implemented change, I saw a lot of questioning, a lot of scrutiny, a lot of backlash. And eventually what that does to us is that my mental health was in a mess, because I was no longer carrying out the vision that I needed to carry out. And now I was dealing with with answering some of the decisions that I was making, and those important decisions, just like transforming the organization. I'm talking about the Uber account that I implemented. I found myself being questioned about that Uber account, which was so beneficial for the staff. So for me, what I saw was the scrutiny, the passive aggressiveness, but also the gaslighting. What I saw was gaslighting, where a lot of us are actually questioned that this is not happening, right? And I even see it after the piece, that there's a lot of gaslighting. There's a lot of half of the things I mentioned there, maybe I was just imagining them myself, So those are the things that a lot of even black women highlight when they actually face or when they try and change the system.
Nkosi, thank you very much for joining us here on Weekend Dawn. Again, we've run out of time, but just to conclude, we were chatting to civil society consultant Sibongile Nkosi about transformation in South Africa within civil society organizations, perhaps what it looks like in this day and age.